Yeah, that's right, YouTubers. I trimmed my beard today. Personal hygiene on the way up. Must be the off season. Dan has a few extra minutes. Kids back in school. Spring break is over. We are rolling, baby. It's Old Man Squad. It's fantasy basketball. I'm Dan Bespers at Dan Bespers on social media. Please hit that subscribe button, and you will now get access to my show here on YouTube. My show, if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify. And again, if you're on the video formats, the great Noah Rubens' first show dropped yesterday. It was a Utah Jazz Dynasty review. His second show drops later today. All so many reasons to subscribe here at Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Today, we are talking about Flyers and how they went. So I couldn't create a great cutoff, and perhaps there are players that sit above this mark that you would consider Flyers. But I look back at the final ADP numbers from this draft season, and I just decided to start with anybody with an ADP outside the top 100. I think that's pretty fair because if you look at the guys with the ADP inside the top 100, these guys are all dudes that got drafted. I don't want to say early, but like reliably in the first 8 to 9 rounds. And then the Flyers are guys that may have slipped a little farther to very far down the board. So that was the cutoff. It may have been right, it may not, but that's what we're going to work with today. Here are the names we're going to be talking about on today's show: Jalen Suggs, Chris Paul, Daniel Gafford, John Collins, Amen Thompson, Josh Hart, Onyeka Okongwu, Cam Johnson, Malik Monk, Norman Powell, PJ Washington, Khalil Ware, Jaden McDaniels, Peyton Pritchard, Kelly Oubre Jr., Christian Brown, Dyson Daniels, and Tari Eason. We're not going to spend a ton of time on each of those names. That's a lot of players. But really, instead, as we work through that list of whatever that was, 15 names, something like that, we're going to be looking to see what these players have in common, not necessarily from a fantasy standpoint, but from a what made them the more successful, minus injuries and shutdowns, selection of Flyers, and how can we use that information for selecting our late round picks going forward. We'll start with Jalen Suggs, who obviously missed half of the season with an injury, played in 35 games. Off to a great start. He was rolling top 60. Then he slowed down. Then he got hurt. Then he tried to come back, and it didn't really work. And so the field goal percent was very low at just 41%. Overall, he did sit in the 8th round in value this year. 16 points, 4 boards, 4 assists, 1.5 steals, 0.9 blocks. The free throw number was actually way up, even though the field goal number was down. Hard to know if that sticks year over year, but this is a guy that just plays himself into an injury basically every single season. Also, he was getting drafted around 105, 110, so he wasn't a super late flyer, meaning you're taking a little bit of a shot that he can both get better and stay healthy. And the reason this one worked, while it worked, was that he was playing starters minutes. He has an okay fantasy stat set, high steals fantasy stat set, did more on offense this year, and was playing starters minutes. Let's keep moving because I don't know how bullish I'm going to be on Suggs next year after yet another injury-prone season. Chris Paul finished at number 83 on a per-game basis. He played in every single regular season game for a San Antonio Spurs team that was not hyper competitive once Victor Wembanyama went down. But there was Chris Paul, 9 points, 3.5 boards, 7.5 assists, 1.3 steals, 1.7 threes. Free throw number was back in the low 90s. Thank goodness. That's where we needed it. Only 1.6 turnovers per game. He had an assist to turnover ratio of about 4.5 to 1. Hell, almost 5 to 1. That's so valuable if you're trying to win assists and not immediately throwing away turnovers. The field goal percent was down at 43. That's just probably not a number that's going to get back where it was when he had speed and elevation and whatever. But he was there as a super high efficiency, old man type of dude. And trying to figure out exactly why Chris Paul panned out. I mean, he was getting drafted a little bit outside the top 100, as the board shows you, 104. So it wasn't like he was a massive steal there. My thought process was, and why I liked Chris Paul this year, was that they brought him in to lead the Spurs towards, I think their hope was a play-in berth, but that vanished when Wemby went down. But they just needed some sort of veteran presence. Now, the problem going forward, of course, is that De'Aaron Fox is there. Chris Paul gets a year older. Hard to say that he's going to necessarily have this same role the following year, but the stars aligned for it to work this time around. Guys, now's the time. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for all sports betting action. You've got the largest selection of odds over at BetOnline: baseball, hockey playoffs, basketball playoffs, UFC. BetOnline remains your number one source for sports betting info. Want to get down on something going on today? Why the hell not? Lakers are 5.5-point favorites in game 2 against Minnesota. I would probably look at Minnesota unless you think that who actually makes shots pivots hard the other way. Or perhaps you'd like to look at an under. Maybe you think that series is going to slow down. Maybe you think the Grizzlies have a shot to actually keep today's game a little bit closer. I don't know. I'm not telling you what to do today. By the way, you got 3 games. Pacers and Bucks are also playing. Maybe you think Damian Lillard comes back and looks terrible after missing a ton of time. Maybe you think he looks good. Do you think the Thunder blow out Memphis again? There's a lot of stuff going on right now. And if you join today, there are bonuses hanging around. There's free spins you can get when you make your first deposit. You can get up to $250 in free bets when you make that first deposit. Head to BetOnline today and make that first deposit immediately. You don't even need to use a promo code to do it. And then, of course, if you're bored and there are no games happening, like right now when I'm recording, BetOnline has a casino with Vegas-style games, casino games. They've got a live casino. So, like, if you want to do slots, that's a thing you could do. Or you can go and play blackjack. You can play, I think they've got poker there. Make sure I got my information right. Table games, video poker, specialty games. They got tournaments, single deck, multi-hand blackjack. They got all these wild blackjack variants that you can check out over there. BetOnline, the game starts here. Daniel Gafford was the next name on the list, and this is an easy one to figure out. He was number 98, and it only worked because guys missed time. Derek Lively continues to just not really be a fully healthy dude, but the Mavs traded for Anthony Davis, and yes, I know that Gafford and Lively are going to be the centers, quote unquote, the centers going forward, and AD's the power forward, but the stars no longer align for Gafford this coming year. What about John Collins? This is one where you could argue it went great for half the year and then absolutely awful the other half. He played 40 games as a top 50 fantasy player, and Utah just pulled the plug on him. Is next year the year the Jazz actually start to compete again? I've got to think that they're kind of running out of time to continue to tank, at least while they've got these types of players floating around. So there's a few things that could happen here. First thing that happens is the Jazz actually try to be a little bit more competitive this coming season, which still feels maybe not quite there. The other thing is John Collins is an expiring contract this coming season, which makes him both a very interesting and very risky play. Someone's going to want that contract. An expiring $26 million deal, that's a pretty movable number. People didn't want to give up much for it this year because then they would be on the hook for John Collins again next season. But they'll move him this coming year if they're not trying to be competitive. So my feeling is John Collins actually is probably a better pick this coming year. He might not get to do as much on a day-to-day basis, but odds are he's not going to be in full shutdown mode. They're probably going to get something for him. They're probably going to move him as opposed to just letting his contract run out. And hell, if they do compete, then he'll be a part of what they're doing. So I actually think John Collins, while everyone's going to have a super sour taste in their mouth from him, and for good reason, I think he actually makes sense as a very interesting Flyer this coming year because I think he's going to play. He has a really good fantasy game, and I think instead of a shutdown, he probably gets moved. Amen Thompson at 116. This is one that we talked about a truckload during the preseason. It was a pretty easy predictable breakout kind of dude because he has that insane fantasy game. He has that insane freak athleticism. He was hovering around the edge of the top 100 when the Rockets were fully healthy. As soon as guys started to bite the dust, then he rocketed up the board, and they're just going to have to find ways to play him this coming year. Thompson is not going to be a Flyer, so we don't even really need to worry about him. But in terms of like what made it work, well, insane fantasy game. What about Josh Hart? This is an interesting one because his ADP this year was 117, and Josh Hart finished the season as the number 25th ranked fantasy player on 14 points, a 3-ball, 9.5 rebounds, 6 assists, 1.5 steals, 52% from the field, 78% at the free throw line, 2 turnovers a game. He was an unbelievably well-rounded fantasy play who averaged, wait for it, like 37 minutes per game this year. You know, he got Thibodeau run, and he didn't break down. So whatever the Knicks did from a training standpoint, whatever, it worked really well with Josh Hart. Now, obviously, he's not going to be a Flyer next year because everybody saw what happened this season. Why did Josh Hart work? He worked because the Knicks thinned the herd. They just kept dumping dudes until they had 6 guys that they were willing to play. I should have been far more bullish on Josh Hart than I was. My thought was that he probably would play himself into an injury. But at pick 117, that kind of doesn't matter. What was Hart last season? I feel like after the move to New York, 2023, 2024, the final like 3-ish months, he was number 75 and about the same number of playing time. He shot 52% this year after 43%, basically mid-40s with New York last year. So is that something that we can count on to continue? A medium negative in field goal actually becomes a small positive? Because the other stuff for him actually didn't change all that much. The steals were up a little bit. The rebounds are actually down a tiny bit. Like, it was really the field goal percent that moved him 4 rounds up the board. I don't know is the answer to that question. Josh Hart, like, he'd never been the world's worst or the world's greatest field goal percent guy. He's 47 for his career, which is very fine. But, you know, looking at last year, where he, by the way, he also played 81 games last season, where I think he was already in New York for that one, but 43%. His role again expanded as the Knicks lost guys to injury. In Portland the year before, he shot 50%. In New York the year before, he shot 59%. This year back up to 53%. It's really hard to say. His 2-point field goal efficiency has gone through the roof, but really it's been pretty good since about 2020. Like, he's been a high 50s to low 60s 2-point field goal guy since then. 3-pointers haven't changed all that much. Right around 33% almost every single year. Percentage of his shots coming from 3-point land is lower this year. That was helpful. You know, just thinking through like, hey, how many threes did he take versus how many shots? Took about a third of his shots from 3-point land this year. Last year, it was more like 40% of his shots were 3-pointers. So that was something. He also had his worst 2-point shooting year last season since his sophomore year in the NBA. So I think the reality probably falls somewhere in between 43% and 53%. And so if you expect Josh Hart to be around a 48%er, that still puts him in that top 50 discussion. Probably not top 30 anymore. But in terms of Flyer, like, obviously he's not going to be a Flyer this coming year. You're just looking to see if he gets drafted at 50 or 70, and then you make your call on whether you think that's worthwhile. Onyeka Okongwu. This is one we've just been waiting on and waiting on and waiting on, and it looked like it was going to be the same old crap again, and then he got the starting job. Finally, it happened. Once it happened, he was insanely good. Top 50, basically, once he became the full-time starter. Top 30 the second half of the year. He's a guy that I actually think, believe it or not, is going to get underdrafted despite the insane run. This is a third-round fantasy player with small amounts of untapped upside, believe it or not. He was only blocking one shot a game over that stretch. He's not a big-time shot blocker, but he's a good percentages center. I would very happily take Okongwu in the Jared Allen corridor that we talked about on yesterday's show, which is like all the centers that go between 40 and 60. And I think he hits that marker. Cam Johnson at 122. He actually has a chance to be in kind of that flyer discussion again because of his situation. He was top 55 pretty much the entire season, very reliably. He basically, you want to say missed, but sat out a third of the year was kind of the way things went for Cam Johnson. His contract is not terrible. It's basically the same as who the hell were we just talking about a minute ago? John Collins. Cam is in the mid-20s, 23 this year. It actually goes down to 21 this coming season, then back up to 23. So, of course, the problem with Cam is that there are 2 seasons left. Someone that is going to trade for him is going to want to have to, like, make him part of the project for a couple of seasons. The Nets presumably are going to be asking for a decent return for him, which does worry me a little bit that he could go into shutdown mode again. But what made it work for Cam Johnson? Well, the fact that he just had a larger role because the guys around him were bad. And that was all we really needed because his fantasy game has always been a good one. He's a decent steals, high efficiency scorer. Those guys are hard to find because they don't ruin your percentages while also getting you a decent chunk of 3-pointers. Some steals, not much in the way of rebounds or assists, but yeah, a few assists this year because he had to just do more. But you're also looking at a guy who might play 55 to 60 ball games again this coming season. So if he falls down into that 120 whatever range, I think you can almost just sit on the same result. Malik Monk at his ADP was 130, and he actually was pretty bad at the beginning and the end of the year. He was good in the middle when he had a kind of an unfettered starter's job. I have no idea what the Kings are going to look like next year. None. They've already been knocked out. And Monk missed the end of the year with a calf strain. It happened late in the year. He had a series of nagging things throughout the year. That's what cost him 17 ball games. But is Keon Ellis the starting shooting guard next season? Who's going to be the head coach next year? Who's even going to be on the team? I don't know. It's very hard to say. I don't think I'm taking a shot on Malik Monk. I think he's going to get drafted earlier than I'd want in a standard 9-cat league. I think I'd rather take a shot ultra late on Keon Ellis and hope that he gets 27, 28 minutes a ball game as opposed to Monk. Although I know it's Monk has the assist upside between those guys. He has the free throw upside between those guys. He has the scoring upside between those guys. So a lot of formats that makes more sense. What made Malik Monk work? Luck. Truly. Because he was like number 140 until DeMar DeRozan went down. Monk moved into the starting lineup. The Kings had a very easy schedule spot, and they won a bunch of games. And they were like, oh, it must have been Malik Monk. No, it wasn't. He had a good run in there, though. How about Norman Powell? A lot of that was Kawhi Leonard. You guys didn't believe me. Powell finished at number 80 this year, but remember where he was for most of the season? Norman Powell was sitting top 40 for almost the entire year, and then Kawhi got ramped up, and Norman was outside the top 200 after that, which, again, that's probably a bigger swing than expected. Powell should have been drafted this past season based on the expectation that he turns into a pumpkin when Kawhi Leonard comes back. It was kind of the same story as Al Horford. Going to turn into a pumpkin when Kristaps Porzingis came back. It's just that KP came back quicker than expected, and Kawhi, as expected, took too long. So that's something you can look out for, though. We don't know who's going to be hurt starting next year yet, but think about Philadelphia. What if Embiid is not ready to start the year? Do you take a shot on someone like a Gershon Yabusele or an Adem Bona or an Andre Drummond? I don't know. We'll see when we get there. But that's what Norman Powell was. It just so happened he carved it out for 3 months because of Kawhi's slow timeline, when maybe the initial thought was like, we get 4 to 6 weeks out of Norman. Instead, we got more like 12. PJ Washington, he was a good flyer this last year. He's not going to be going forward because the Mavs are big and bulky and nobody really knows what the hell they are anymore. But PJ worked because the Mavs had an opening for him to play big minutes, and he didn't even need to shoot the ball all that well. He just needed to be alongside Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic at that point, and it worked. And then at the end of the year, it didn't work really. Fairly straightforward. But in terms of like, it doesn't matter that he flopped once the Mavs moved bodies around and he got hurt and they had all the big men on earth, and it didn't make sense to play him at power forward or center anymore. We want guys playing up, by the way. That's generally a fantasy positive for guys to sort of play up in size. Why did PJ work? Because he was another guy that was going to get 30 minutes a game. When you're late on the board here, and let's go through some of the other names that didn't even have a listed ADP. Khalil Ware, that would have been a crazy draft pick because he didn't even play like the first month of the year. Jaden McDaniels was an interesting one, especially because he got off to a slow start again, but then got cooking. Minnesota got hurt. That's when he kind of opened things up a little bit. It's actually right before. It was like 4 games before Wolves started getting hurt. Jaden started looking a little bit more like himself. Why was he a guy that might have made sense? Honest to God, I couldn't tell you. Because for years, he's been a guy that we've looked at around 125, but never had the fantasy game to justify drafting him. But he finally started to do a little bit of stuff on offense. That's always been the deal. Is it because Cat is gone? And so, now it's one of those situations where Jaden's looking around like, well, it's me versus Dante DiVincenzo instead of me versus Cat. In those spots, it's like, give it to Cat. He's a better offensive player. Duh. But now it's kind of like, oh, well, this open shot for me is just as good or better than Dante getting that shot. I'll take this shot. And it's not a conscious thing like, oh, he's thinking, oh, there's Dante over there. I'm going to take this shot. Or there's Julius Randle who's going to bounce the ball until it deflates. It's just it's an internal thing for some of these guys where it's like, look, I'm just as good an option. Ant's on the bench or he's triple covered or whatever. I got to go be an offensive force or this system isn't going to work. Should I have seen that coming? I don't know. Nobody really did. He was a pickup. Peyton Pritchard was a massive surprise this year, who faded, not surprisingly, as the season went on. He pretty much sat, so he got off to like a top 30, top 40 start, and then once the three-pointers came back down from almost 5 a game, he finished right around top 80, which was still very good, playing 29 minutes a game, far more than any of us expected. The question I have for Peyton Pritchard going forward is, can his percentages hold up? Because he was at like a 49-89 splits this year. He's damn close to a 50-40-90 guy. He shot 41% from downtown. He was at 85 from the free throw line. Like, this is a high efficiency dude. And does that hold? Well, the field goal percent, about the same year over year. 64% from 2 feels probably unsustainable. So I would assume that the field goal percent probably ticks down a little bit for Pritchard. I don't know that the other stuff can really get a whole lot better than it was unless Boston gives up a guard in the offseason. So this is probably a best case scenario for him and why I didn't really pay him much attention going into drafts. Kelly Oubre, he ended up with a pretty good year, but that was mostly because Philly was beat up. So keep an eye on that, certainly. But, that's not one where we can take a big lesson away. Christian Braun, this was one where, looking back, and I picked him up in a bunch of spots. I ended up with far more Christian Braun than I ever expected I would. I did not draft him anywhere, but I think I had him on half of my fantasy teams after his first 1 or 2 games where I was like, all right, maybe this guy doesn't shoot 60% for the entire year. By the way, he shot 58% for the entire year. But I got to pick him up because he's the heir apparent to Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and he has better fantasy game than KCP did. And that's another thing. Like, you got to understand the situation. You got to understand the teammates. For Brown, I needed, and I got this one wrong. I'm lucky that I picked him up in so many places and yelled about it on the podcast, but I didn't draft him anywhere. And he basically didn't get drafted anywhere because I think going into the year, it seemed like it was going to be kind of Brown versus Peyton Watson versus Russell Westbrook, who was going to get all those extra minutes that KCP had. And they just all went to Brown. I don't think any of us really thought that he was going to get like 100% of the KCP minutes, but he got them, all of them. And he was very good all season long with one little minor lull, but he finished at number 61 in 9Cat. He played in 81? No, 79, I think, out of 82 games. Something very good on that front. And it ended up being as probably the pickup of the season in fantasy. But how did we all miss him? The answer to that question lies in what Brown had done the prior year and why it wasn't clear that he was going to have really, really good fantasy game. Last season, Brown shot 46% from the field, 69% at the free throw line. In 20 minutes a game, he had half a steal and half a block. You extrapolate that to 30, which I think we could, if we thought he was going to start, you could safely say around 30 minutes. You're still only talking around, 0.8 steals, 0.7 blocks. You're talking about 10 points, 5 rebounds. And then all of a sudden, 10 points, 5 rebounds, and 0.8 of each defensive stat is not a top 100 player. And it's frankly not all that close if he was a negative in both percentages. Somehow, and this was like the Brandon Ingram move to New Orleans type of year, his field goal percent went up by 12. His 2-point field goal percent went from 50 to 65, which, by the way, also doesn't feel exactly sustainable. The only thing that stayed on a line for Brown was rebounding. He played about 50% more playing time, and he grabbed about 50% more rebounds. That was like the only thing that stayed. Well, assists sort of also. But like the steal rate got better. He went up to 1.1 steals per game instead of 0.7 and 0.8. Blocks actually didn't change all that much, but that one bounces around a little bit. Scoring more than doubled. He went from 6 shots a game to 10, but his scoring more than doubled because of the field goal percent jump. So what do we think of Christian Brown going forward? That doesn't actually really matter. That's not the point of today's show. The point of today's show is to say, well, should we have seen this coming? And the answer is not really. He had shown nothing in his 2 seasons in the NBA for us to believe that he was going to be an 83% foul shooter and a 58% field goal guy. Previous high in field goal percent was 49.5 his rookie year. How on earth could we assume that that would get up near 60? If he had done everything the same this year, but shot 50% instead of 58, he would have been hovering back near the edge of the top 100. And it wouldn't have been such an astoundingly powerful season. But he did, so it was. And so to that end, I say, all right, well, the one thing we can look at is if you get to, the 12th, 13th round and your favorite players aren't out there anymore, just take a guy who's going to play 32 minutes a game and you don't really know how it's going to go. And the last 2 names to analyze on today's show before we sort of summarize everything, Dyson Daniels and Tari Eason. Now, Dyson Daniels did more than any of us could have ever expected. He was on all of our boards. You can go back and look at the bucket list. You can listen to all of our preseason shows. We had my shows. We had my guest shows. There were probably somewhere between 10 and 20 episodes of Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball during draft season last year where we talked about Dyson Daniels being a great flyer pick at the end. Because not only was he a great flyer, but he wasn't even getting drafted in the first 10 rounds. He was going outside the top 120. And in one of my leagues, I didn't even have to draft him in the 13th. I took someone else I wanted, and I picked up Dyson Daniels. I put in a pretty high fab bid on him. Stuck somebody on IL. I mean, that was like candy from a baby kind of moment. Why did that one work? Well, that was this Dyson Daniels, not to say that he was an easy call, because none of us thought he was going to be a second rounder this year in 9Cat. But I think a lot of us thought he had top 75 potential pretty easily based on 2 weeks in New Orleans. That's all it took. There were 2 weeks, not this past season, the prior one, where Dyson Daniels started and played around 30 minutes a game. He was ranked outside the top 100, but that's because he shot like, I forget the exact number. I think he shot like 27% from the field over those 2 weeks. And an obvious and unsustainably low marker from the field. But he was averaging around 2 steals per game. No one was letting him shoot on that team, but he was getting some rebounds. He was getting some assists. There were all these indicators that was like, look, if this dude gets 30 minutes a game somewhere else and doesn't shoot 27%, not only could he be a top 100 guy, he probably goes higher than that. Well, then he blew us all away by shooting 49% from the field and averaging 3 steals a game, which is crazy. I don't think anybody's done that since Chris Paul like 2 decades ago. And he got involved on offense, and he did a bunch of rebounding, and he proved himself to be even better than the good we thought he was going to be. I thought a best case scenario for Dyson Daniels was like top 60, which again still made him an unbelievably obvious pick at the end of your draft. But that was one where we had the data and the Hawks sort of telegraphed that he was going to be their starter alongside Trae Young. So like we had all the information we wanted to call Dyson Daniels an easy pick. Tari Eason was a harder one. I took him as my last pick in a bunch of drafts, just thinking, why the hell not? Because he had really good fantasy game, but I had no idea if he was going to get enough playing time. And then at the beginning of the year, he did so much rebounding and stealsing that it didn't matter. Guys started getting hurt around him. He started getting days off. He got hurt. He got more days off when he came back. He missed a ton of playing time. But again, you're talking about a guy who just has good fantasy game. That's the Tari Eason story, and why you take a shot at the very end. It's why I took Jonathan Isaac in a couple of leagues, roto leagues. I'm not going to take him in head-to-head to say, look, like I know this guy has good fantasy game. What if he gets 23 minutes a game? For Tari Eason, it was what if he gets 25 minutes a game? One of those things did happen, and that's the type of thing you look for going forward. So how do we use this information looking towards next year? Well, we don't know what the board is going to look like, but the key things are, and you guys might remember this, and we'll talk about it as we ramp up towards draft season next year, the 3 boxes to check when you're looking for picks in general are great. Does this person have really good fantasy stat sets? Do these guys? So like, do their minutes translate to fantasy value? Number 2, do they have opportunity? Meaning, are they going to play? Is this person going to get 25 minutes a game, 28, 30, whatever? And number 3, will they do stuff when they play? So sometimes a guy has good fantasy game, but he's buried so far in the rotation that he doesn't get to actually do it. And these guys are easy to find at the beginning of a draft. Literally every single name on the board checks all 3 of those boxes. You start to get to around pick 50 or 60, and you get to guys that maybe don't check all of those boxes. We can look at the ADPs from this last year if you want to see examples of this. If I could get this thing to scroll a little faster. So look at someone with an ADP like around 80, like Jabari Smith Jr. Does he have good fantasy game? Will he get to do stuff when he's on the floor? Will he play? Probably. So checks like 1.5 out of 3 boxes. That's why we didn't draft much Jabari Smith Jr. Keegan Murray, another example of a guy going in the 80s. Is he going to play? Probably. Does he have decent fantasy game? Yeah, kind of. Not great, but okay. Is he going to get to do anything with DeMar DeRozan in town this last year? And then anyway, Zach LaVine got added part way. Nah, that's where you don't trust him. What about a guy that we did trust? What about like who was in this same range that we looked at? Walker Kessler, Ivica Zubac. These are really interesting ones. Zubac was going around 87. Is he going to play? Well, let's actually do that one last. Does he have fantasy game? The answer is mostly. So like a 0.75 on that. Is he going to play? The answer was probably yes, because the Clippers got even thinner at center this past year. And then the third one was the really interesting one, which was, do we think he's going to do stuff when he's on the court? And for multiple seasons, the answer there was not really. This year, knowing Kawhi was out for half the season and Harden just wants to run pick and roll with Zubac, the answer went from no to yes. So now all of a sudden we have 3 yeses, or like 2 3/4 yeses. And that's why Zubac was a guy that we targeted everywhere. Look at some of the names we just talked about today. They're even farther down the board. What about someone like a Cam Johnson? Does he have fantasy game? Yes. Is he going to do stuff when he's on the court? Yes. Is he going to play? Yes. Is he going to play all year? No. But that was a different problem. That's why Cam Johnson made sense at the end of drafts. We don't know these things for sure. We're obviously, we're just taking information and we're pushing it all together. And someone you could say, oh, you didn't know that Cam Johnson was going to have a higher usage rate this year. Well, I mean, we kind of did, because Brooklyn got rid of all of their high usage guys besides Cam Thomas. And so it was basically just those 2 dudes now. What about Norm? Norman Powell's a good one. Was he going to play? Yeah. Does he have fantasy game? Yeah. Is he going to get to do stuff while Kawhi is out? So that was a 3 that's going to become a 2. That's the criteria. It doesn't always work, but if you run them through that, like Jaden McDaniels, is he going to do stuff when he's on the court? We don't know. Is he going to play? Yeah. Does he have fantasy game? So that was like a 1.5. That's why we didn't take him. He was better than expected. Christian Brown, is he going to play? Sounded like a yes. Does he have fantasy game? No. Is he going to do stuff when he's on the court? Don't know. Like 1.25. So there are going to be surprises that pop up, but still, that 1.25 is better than a lot of guys around him there. Like, think about some of these other guys who had an ADP late like that, like a Dylan Brooks. You know he's going to play, but you know he doesn't have fantasy game. You know it already. What about, I don't know. In any event, we can do more of this stuff going towards next year, but just looking back at this past season and why we passed up on certain guys, but not others. You're looking for guys, hopefully, that have like 1.5 of those boxes checked or more. Keontae George, is he going to play? Yeah. Is he a fantasy game? Nah. Is he going to get to do stuff when he's out there? I mean, I guess. But if you don't have fantasy game, I don't know that it really matters. So you almost need to have that 1 box checked. Maybe I need to change this to 4 boxes. Does it matter? Bobby Portis, does he have fantasy game? Sorta. Is he going to play? Sorta. Is he going to do stuff when he's out there? Yeah. So that's like a 1 and some odd. So basically, you're looking for guys where you can get to 2. You'll grade it out a little bit. Cam Johnson gave you a 2. Josh Hart, that should have been a 2 or higher. I don't know why I wasn't higher on him. Okongwu, fantasy game, yes, but is he going to play and do stuff? We didn't know. Dyson Daniels, yes. Like, that's the way you isolate the ones that you know are winners from the outset, and then you kind of work your way down the board. Klay Thompson, he was going much earlier. Does he have fantasy game? Nope. Is he going to play? Probably. Is he going to do stuff when he's out there? I don't know. Not enough. That's between a 1 and a 1.5. It's not enough for me. Jeremy Grant, is he going to play? That's a joke. Brandon Pajemski, did he have fantasy game last year? Actually, not really. Is he going to play? We didn't know. Is he going to do stuff when he's out there? We don't know. That's why we avoided him. He got good the last 3 weeks. So again, all these wins aren't going to fit into that, like, check all 3 boxes. But if you can find the guys that do, that are going later, those are the guys you want to start with, and you just work your way down the list. Does that make sense? Maybe. We'll talk a ton more about that leading up to draft season. Let's wrap this sucker up. It went longer than expected. I am Dan Bespris for Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Back at you tomorrow. 1 show a day, Monday through Friday. Must be the off-season. This is off-season show 7, by the way. You've made it so far. I wore my Lakers hat today. Big game tonight. See you guys.